Sorry to break up the fun. All right, we're going to start today's meeting with our work session, and this is on public-private partnership policy. Ken Bowers. And I just want to say that Corey is absent and excused. Mary Black is absent and excused from the work session, and Stormy is on her way and absent and excused till she gets here. Thank you.
Great. Morning.
Good
Mayor
morning.
And Council. Ken Bowers with Planning and Development. I'm here to present a proposed refresh of the city's partnership policy. So I'm going to start with a little context as to why we're here talking about this. I will then go into some detail, but not as much detail as that long memo that was in your backup about what we're proposing in terms of refreshing the policy, and then close with discussion and next steps. So we recently executed a cost-sharing agreement or reimbursement agreement with a developer doing proposing an apartment project on Hodges Street. They had an interest in seeing this Greenway Bridge that was proposed in the Midtown area plan get built in time for their development, and they offered to help fund it and take over the construction management part of it. And so we executed a reimbursement agreement with that, and that precipitated a request from council to revisit our current policy on these types of partnerships and see if it could be updated. That policy is from 2017. It was drafted by the Transportation Department and for the specific purpose of guiding the expenditures of some partnership money that was put into the transportation bond. The new policy is trying to broaden the applicability of this to different types of partnerships and things beyond transportation infrastructure, and we feel that's important for plan implementation. So, a significant part of the city's geography is covered by an adopted area plan. These area plans often have capital projects, either specific projects or sort of broad concepts for future capital projects embedded within them. And many of these are something the city could not really implement the vision by itself. We would need private partners to do it. I'll pick on the Midtown Green concept that was from the Midtown, walkable Midtown area plan. It calls for a waterfront park on the Crabtree Creek, but fronting that waterfront park is some private development that would bring a new scale of development to the Wake Forest Road area. So the city going it alone to build a park here is probably less desirable than seeing how you could leverage the real estate value that would be created by a park amenity in this location, capture some of that and use it to fund and build the park. But that would require us to enter into some sort of partnership arrangement to make that happen. And I think that's true of many things that are in our area plans. Ultimately, our area plans are about building a better city. And as the public sector, we're responsible for sort of the base infrastructure, the substrate on which development lands. We plan for the transportation of infrastructure and often provide it in concert with NCDOT. We provide the water and sewer utility, and we provide public amenities that make the city livable. Private developers build the buildings that we all live and work in. And they have to do some infrastructure typically as part of a code requirement, but anything that's off-site or over and above a code requirement, if we want to deliver that in concert with development, requires some sort of partnership arrangement. And when there's an opportunity to deliver a piece of infrastructure that is beneficial to both the private developer and the city, there's often an opportunity to deliver that project more effectively than if the parties were to go it alone. And we've taken many steps towards wider and more effective use of partnership agreements in recent years. The first formal agreement that we could kind of land on that was tied specifically to the development project was an arrangement with Kane Realty and the Dillon to provide parking for Union Station within the parking deck for the Dillon development. We talked about the 2017 policy and its relationship to the stormwater bond. There was some development agreements, which is a tool that the city just recently used for the first time. The applicability of that statute was broadened back in 2019. Housing bond has money for partnerships. The recent parks bond references pursuing partnerships to help fill funding gaps. We adopted a tax increment grant policy, which is a potential partnership tool in 21, and then did some reorg within planning and development to create the urban projects, a group that was specifically tasked with pursuing plan and project implementation with partnerships as part of that. And since that time, we've done the Hodges Street agreement. We've sold some land related to Smoky Hollow to help fund that park, and we're currently in discussions with some private partners on Commerce Place to create a new pedestrian street in the warehouse district. The statutory authority for all of this is very important. Don't need to go into this in great detail other than to say that development agreements, there's a statute for that. There's also sometimes people use the term development agreement to refer to things that don't necessarily implement the statute, but are some agreement between the city and a developer to do certain things. Among those are reimbursement agreements for which there is specific authority. And a couple of years ago, the council adopted a local ordinance, actually a year and a half ago, adopted local ordinances implementing our ability to use these statutes. We often use ground leases for affordable housing projects, and we are able to do land sales both through the statutory mechanisms and then through special charter authority that gives us some more flexibility when city has some property where we can make better use of it through a partnership arrangement. The last thing on this list is a very specific statute that's for the delivery of construction projects. Instead of a typical design bid build, you can use a P3 delivery mechanism. As I'll get into, that is comes with a lot of very specific legal requirements. That's not part of this policy. That's something that would be dealt with independently following the detailed statutory requirements. So in updating the policy, we wanted to start thinking first, why are we doing this? What is our philosophy behind partnerships? We wanted a policy that would cover all the different types of partnership arrangements we might want to enter into. And then we based on that, came up with a process for how these would be reviewed and vetted internally with all the relevant staff, as well as with the city council, and then what would be the formal approval process. So, the purpose of having a policy is there's a lot of discussion and negotiation that goes on between staff and a potential private partner to get to an initial set of terms that would be ready to present to the council for some action or some direction on. And in order for the staff to feel confident that we are implementing the council's desires and engaging in those types of negotiations, having an adopted policy that says, if you're following the parameters of this policy, you're on the right track, gives us the confidence to represent the city at the staff level when we're dealing with the private sector. And so we have constructed this philosophy that the partnerships, have to meet two big tests. One is they are advancing council priorities and providing a public benefit that exceeds the costs that are that the city is incurring, and that by going into a partnership, we're doing something that has some sort of advantage over a traditional procurement method of designing a project and putting it out for competitive bidding. And so that all has to relate to who is bearing the cost, the risk, and how much value is being created between the city and a private partner. The three types of partnerships covered here. This is based on a very good report from the Urban Land Institute about how to construct successful partnerships. First is to develop infrastructure. So that's, I think, what was mostly aimed at in the 2017 policy. And it's essentially you work with a private partner to deliver some infrastructure in conjunction with a development project. The second type, not covered by that policy, is when city has an asset that we are not utilizing to its full value, that by making that asset available to a private partner, we can unlock value. Often that asset is a piece of real estate, and sometimes the value is simply cash, but other times it could be some sort of in-kind contribution that has value. And then the third is to facilitate the development of an area. So if the city wants to see a specific development outcome in a specific location, but public sector participation is necessary to make that happen, that would be a type 3 partnership. Sometimes in weaker market cities, that's aimed at revitalizing an area. That's less of an issue in Raleigh, whether you have a strong market, or it may be to put a particular use that on its own is a loss leader for something else. So we think about a convention center, hotel, or a sports facility, requires some public partnership to make it happen, and then it catalyzes economic activity around it that then pays back that civic investment. Things that are not intended to be covered by this policy, we're not covering things that a developer would otherwise be on the hook for because they're code requirements. We're not covering established programs such as Raleigh Water's reimbursement programs for utility infrastructure, or the affordable housing programs that our Housing and Neighborhood Department administers. We're not covering stuff that's being done under the specific P3 statute for project delivery, and we're not using this to implement zoning conditions unless they were tied to a larger development agreement that was part of that zoning. Just some recent case studies. The Hodges Street Greenway Bridge is a classic example of partnering with a private developer to deliver a piece of infrastructure, in this case a Greenway Bridge that was identified in the Midtown Area Plan, aligned with Industrial Drive. Developer saw that Greenway Bridge as providing access to amenities for their future residents. The city saw it as something that we had identified in the plan. It was going to connect through the development to serve an existing neighborhood and provide those residents with better Greenway access, and seemed to fit within the overall Neighborhood Connector program. The agreement calls for, has three things. The developer pays a portion of the cost. They assume all the risk for cost overruns, and they also assume all the overhead for construction management, and they effectively finance the project on the city's behalf, as no payments are due to the developer until the project is completed and ready for opening. Smoky Hollow land sale. Here's an underutilized asset, a strip of land that had little or perhaps negative value towards the park, but did have value to an adjacent landowner with development plans for the property. We were able to convert that latent value into money that was then able to be applied towards the construction budget for the park. Commerce Place Streetscape, we also did a land sale there, in that case through an upset bid process for a little strip of former railroad right-of-way that we'd owned since the 1930s. That was converted into cash that's now going to be applied to both affordable housing and to a future streetscape improvement here. And it also helps provide more vitality to the warehouse district by creating a new amenity. And then more square development, again, converting real estate into money that can be then plowed into public benefits such as affordable housing, as well as helping to spark development in a portion of downtown that is kind of lagged behind, say, the western parts of downtown. So that would be both a type 2 and type 3. So the current review process, we felt, there's since 2017, there's some new council adopted policy guidance and plans that were not referenced there, and I'll get into those. We didn't really get into whether or not a partnership arrangement was better than a conventional delivery process, and the basic terms were kind of inflexible. They were the basic term that had to be met was that the private partner was paying at least half or more of the project cost. Well, that's often a good benchmark, but it's not always a good benchmark depending on the nature of the project. And if the alternative is paying 100% of it, maybe paying 70% is a good deal when you balance it all out in terms of the mix of public and private benefits. So that was the thing. And in fact, looking at this, some aspect of this policy has been waived for every project that's come under its umbrella. So we are proposing a three-step test or for evaluation for the review process, and this is done by staff and eventually presented to council for acceptance. The first thing is eligibility, which is the project worth doing? And so we have adapted the scoring system and criteria from the 2017 policy and updated it to reflect some new thinking and some new council actions. One thing we said is that if the city is identified, if the council has voted to put a project in an area plan or in the capital program, that's all that we need to know, that's a project that's worth doing. If it's not in the capital plan and it's not in an area plan, then there's some additional hurdles. You need to meet at least two of the criteria off the list to be eligible. And apologize for the small type, but these are basically the criteria. There's 12 of them. The first two are is the project is an adopted plan. We reference things that didn't exist at the time the prior policy was adopted, such as the Public Project Community Support Fund. Weight Transit Plan was pretty new, but we specifically referenced it in here. We've referenced the Community Climate Action Plan. That was another plan that didn't exist at the time the 27 policy was done. And we've also reflected concerns that have been reflected in other council actions or remarks at the table. We know affordable housing is very important. That's in there. Active transportation is important. That's in there. Equity is important, so that is also in there. Then the appropriateness, and this is, again, a sort of a two-part test. Obviously, we have to have the right statutory authority, either in statute or in the city's charter, to enter into the partnership arrangement being proposed. But beyond that, it needs to be a better way of achieving the objective of the project or investment than purely public execution. And so we've created a list in the policy of things that would meet that test. So if you're better utilizing a city asset, or you are being able to deliver the project more quickly, or you're receiving some cost savings or efficiency from private involvement or financing, or there's room for innovation, or it's better from a risk management standpoint. Those are all reasons why you might use a partnership as opposed to just bidding the project out. And then the fairness question, I think, is very critical. So, whenever the city trades an asset like real estate, we have a legal obligation to receive market value, or there has to be legally recognized public benefits, which are still benchmarked in some numerical way against the underlying appraisal of the land in question. And that's just a constitutional and state law requirement. But we also want to look at the ratio of public and private costs and benefits. If the benefits are mostly on the private side, then so should be the cost, but also that could go the other way. And then risks, I think, are important. They have to be distributed and compensated for. And if you want to shift risk onto your private partner, there's probably going to be some costs associated like that. In the same way that if you're doing construction, construction manager at risk contracting method will often have a higher price tag than lowest bid, but you're paying for the surety of knowing that you have a guaranteed maximum price. So you've shifted risk onto the private partner. You've paid a little premium to do that, but you've insulated yourself from potential downside. It's kind of like buying insurance. So the existing approval process, I think, first of all, let me say that we typically at the staff level gone beyond that. But if you just look at what was put in the policy, nothing appeared before council until there was a detailed legal agreement in place. Well, that's a lot of work to go for when you don't really know if the council is fully on board with the terms of what you're proposing. The other thing is it didn't really have any formal role for any of the adopted boards or commissions. So what we're proposing is that, we either go to a potential private partner with an idea, or maybe more likely they come to us. There's an evaluation period. It happens primarily at the staff level. Here in urban projects, our group would be a coordinating role, but typically the funding agency would be like transportation or parks or another department. We would work with them and all the relevant social subject matter experts to vet the project and evaluate it against these adopted criteria. If it's a parks project, we would probably also do a courtesy presentation to the Parks, Recreation, and Greenway Advisory Board. If it's stormwater, to SMAC, et cetera. And then, we would work with the city manager's office. They have to be comfortable and say, we think this is something the council could support. Based on that evaluation, if it passed those tests, we would draft some initial terms. So that's something that has some meat to it, so there's something for the council to react to, but it doesn't involve all the hours it would take to negotiate an actual legal agreement. We would present that to the council, and then if the council decided to move forward, then we would do the work of the detailed legal agreement. That would come back to the council for presentation and for adoption. And of course, if there's statutory notice requirements associated with that, we would meet that as well. So this is the last slide. Our hope for this is to get some feedback on what we presented, either at this meeting or if you wish to schedule it for some future review. Based on that feedback, we would integrate any changes that need to be made to the draft that we presented to you. And then this may be ambitious, may or later, depending on how much council review there is. We would bring forth a resolution with the revised policy to essentially replace the existing policy with the new policy. So that concludes my presentation, and I am now happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for this information, and I appreciate these more fully thought out ideas around how this could work. Overall, it makes sense to me. I just had a couple of questions.
Sure.
When I have seen some of these partnership ideas, they have been loosely related or tied to rezoning cases. And so one of my questions is, if a deal is predicated on a rezoning case, when does the negotiation process start? So I'll give the example. If I have it right, is the Hodges Street bridge over the Greenway, is that related to that rezoning case we had on Hodges and Poole?
It is and it isn't. So
Okay.
the zoning case went forward without any condition to build a connection there. There is a condition, though, to have a mid-block pedestrian passage that aligns with the street to the south in the neighborhood that would bring people from that neighborhood through the development up to Hodges Street where they could access the bridge. My understanding of how that discussion went was, at the time of the rezoning, there was concern from the neighborhood and concern with staff. How are we going to deal with this street stub? Because it's an actual right-of-way stub that goes into the back of that property. The neighborhood didn't really want the street to connect through to Hodges. Developer, I don't think had a strong opinion, but was fine with not connecting. Staff had concerns about connectivity. A compromise position was, well, there could be pedestrian and bicycle connectivity that could provide most of the benefit that we would get from a street connection. And so that ended up getting built into there. Part of that was like, we have this area plan that says there should be a Greenway bridge here. This could eventually connect through there. The specific proposal for the developer to help fund and manage the construction of the Greenway bridge was not in any way tied to or referenced in the rezoning case. But I think the idea was sparked by the discussions around the rezoning case and connectivity. I think more broadly, your question is, how do we tie these together? And the mechanism to tie them together is a development agreement. And I think because of the city's lack of experience doing development agreements, and hence lack of experience of some of our development community and pursuing them with the city, there's been a reluctance to do that. But it is a tool that's there, and I think it's important, though, for that opportunity to be identified early in the zoning process. If it's identified late in the zoning process, well, then it tends to hold up the whole zoning process because it's going to take several months to negotiate and refine a development agreement. So I think that we're still on a learning curve, both internally and with potential private partners on the use of development agreements. I think as they become more common, that you'll see more use of them when there is an opportunity to build the benefits of a partnership into the decision making. But as it stands, the cases that you have decided where this has been discussed have, for the most part, with that one exception in Northeast Raleigh, you've had to design the zoning case as if the potential for a development agreement was not there because it wasn't part of the case. It wasn't referenced in any way. And if you approved the zoning, there was no surety you were going to get to an agreement later.
So my understanding of these partnerships is they would not be tied to a rezoning case. And so when they are considered by like other boards and in that evaluation stage before they get to council, that they should not assume any change in rezoning, anything that council still has to make a decision on. I guess that's kind of like a question for me. Like, are we negotiating with the idea that this is going to be approved, or are we negotiating with the current situation of the private party?
Yeah, I mean that. So again, they could be tied together
With a development agreement.
with a development agreement. If the development agreement is not tied to the zoning case, then from my perspective, we have to negotiate the development agreement in full knowledge that the zoning may or may not be approved because the council hasn't voted, and the council has to vote on the rezoning based on the merits of the case in front of you, without any reference to the development agreement that does not yet exist. The only way for you to make the fully informed decision is if both pieces are coming in front of you at the same time, which, as I said, there's only one example of that happening to date. It was a fairly simple agreement compared to the complexities that might be in some of these. We think at the staff level that it is potentially a useful tool, but we understand we have to have a willing partner who wants to enter into that type of agreement, and they make their own decision as to whether or not they feel like that's a strategic thing for them.
Thank you.
Ken, if I'm not mistaken, aren't development agreements fairly new, like in terms of being legal?
The statute has been around for a while, but it went under some major revisions in 2019 that were intended to make it a more flexible tool. What it was originally conceived of, the benefit was if you had a very large multi-phase development that was going to unfold over a long period of time, the thing that the development agreement did to the private sector was vest their approvals for an extended period of time, such as if the code changed, they could continue to build out the project under the standards at which time the development agreement was put into force. So it had a vesting role that was attractive for folks undertaking very big projects. When it was rewritten, the vesting benefit is still there, but you can now apply a development agreement to smaller scale developments. In fact, I believe the language is that it can apply to a development of any size. So the need to vest over a long-term phasing period is less the intent. More the intent is to allow there to be an agreement tied to his rezoning that binds both the applicant and the city to do certain things, which cannot be done through the medium of zoning conditions. Right. Zoning conditions can only bind the private property owner to do certain things.
Any other questions or feedback for Ken? Councilmember Patton?
Yeah, hi, thanks. So I really appreciate the steps you've added, the idea of like coming to us before it's fully cooked and you have like invested all the time and hours into something only to have it maybe not get all the way across the finish line. So I appreciate that as like a way to protect your time. I also appreciate the nod to utilizing our boards and commissions, particularly knowing that a lot of these P3 partnerships are parks related, and we have a robust and engaged parks board. The way you phrased it sort of to me sounded a little like we might think about as a courtesy maybe going to the parks board. Is that like a little more firm than that? Like we would definitely take to a relevant board?
Yeah, and if it's not firm enough in the narrative of the policy, we could firm that up.
Okay.
I think, not everything is going to fall under the purview of an adopted board, but some will. And I think lesson learned from Hodges Street is it's good to keep the boards in the loop when these discussions are occurring.
Cool. Awesome.
Okay.
I think we can certainly firm that up.
Okay, that'd be great. I feel great about it.
Anything else? Ken, I appreciate your work on this and bringing this forward. I think this is very much needed, having more clarification and certainty. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say thank you, and we will look forward to having this come back to us.
Thank you.
All right. And next is the sidewalk petition program. Ann Conlon. Hey, Ann.
Okay, good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Council. My name is Ann Conlon. I am the Business Intelligence Supervisor in Transportation, and I am very excited to bring you today the work of Strategic Plan Team Transportation and Transit 5.1. So this team was tasked with evaluating revisions to our transportation programs to improve equitable implementation. And we have been focusing on the sidewalk petition program, and I'm bringing you that work today. This team was cross-departmental. We had representatives from transportation, engineering services, parks, the Office of Community Engagement, and planning. So we got a lot of great perspectives and really value the work of the full team here. So I'm going to cut to the chase of what was our conclusion. We reviewed this program, and our conclusion was that as currently structured, it is not leading to equitable outcomes. And we therefore are recommending to you that we shift to a data-driven approach that I will explain in more detail. We think this is a good time. Currently, all of the outstanding petition sidewalk projects have been fully funded. The backlog is funded, so we are ready to bring forward a new set of our neighborhood sidewalk projects. So I want to put this in context a little bit in the overall sidewalk program, tell you about the history of the petition program, and then really focus in on the review that we did, which started with data analysis and then spent a lot of time in community engagement, and then bring forward the policy revisions for your consideration. So looking at the overall sidewalk program, there are kind of three major blue buckets here that produce new sidewalks in the city. So the city CIP is one of those buckets, but we also see new sidewalks built with NCDOT projects, either through their funding or through city participation in those projects to fund sidewalks. We get a lot of new sidewalks through private development throughout the city, and really our UDO requires new sidewalks with all private development now. So a lot of the needs throughout our neighborhoods are from the time that predated our UDO, when we didn't get those sidewalks with new development. We are trying to fill those gaps in our neighborhoods. So looking at the city CIP, there are two major buckets. Our major street sidewalk projects are driven by the adopted pedestrian plan. This was adopted in 2012 through a public process and identifies and prioritizes sidewalks on all the major streets. So the petition program historically has identified and prioritized sidewalks on your local streets in your neighborhoods, those streets that aren't covered by the pedestrian plan. Looking back a little bit at how many sidewalks do we deliver in these different buckets? If you look at the 5-year period up to 2022, we had kind of a similar mileage of our major street sidewalks and our local street sidewalks. So this really emphasizes that we put a lot of resources into these local street sidewalks, and it's critical that the structure of this program is leading us to equitable outcomes. To give you kind of a sense of what sorts of streets are we talking about, some recent major sidewalks that you awarded the bid for were on Millbrook Road, Spring Forest Road, and New Hope Church Road. So that's kind of our major street. And then some local petition projects moving forward are on Rembert Drive and Brighton Road. So as I've mentioned, historically, our neighborhood sidewalks were initiated by resident requests. They submitted a petition to us, and if it wasn't in the pedestrian plan, staff would evaluate that and then bring it back to property owners on the street for balloting. I'll talk a little bit more about balloting later, but that was the previous structure. This program was suspended in 2020 due to a backlog of projects that had insufficient funding. So again, you all have fully funded that backlog. That backlog is now cleared. So how did the team approach this review? We relied on the Racial Equity Toolkit, which has principles for how to complete this kind of a review of a program. We really leaned on the City of Raleigh equity team. Letitia Holmes, former planning department staff, was my co-lead on this initiative and a part of that team, and they gave us great guidance. So we started again with that desired result. We are working toward a neighborhood sidewalk delivery program that leads to equitable outcomes, and we spent time in data analysis and then in community engagement. We are now here with a strategy for you in that fourth step, and then would move into the implementation and circling back with the community on accountability. This approach, the Racial Equity Toolkit and the Racial Equity Lens, uses these 5 framing questions as we dug into our data analysis and our engagement. We want to understand who is benefiting from this program structure, who is burdened by the current program structure, what are the racial impacts, if there are some, what are the root causes of any disparities that we find, and what are the unintended consequences of developing our sidewalk projects in this way. So these charts really are the meat of our data analysis findings. So I'm just going to spend a minute explaining them because they're kind of a lot to take in when you first see them. So when we looked at this, we wanted to consider not just where are we receiving petitions, but also where are the needs, because we would expect to see where the gaps are in the neighborhoods, that's where we would be receiving petitions. So the lighter blue bars here are showing you where are those missing sidewalks in our neighborhoods. The darker blue purple bars are showing you where we received petitions. So on these charts, anywhere where the petition, the darker bar, is higher than the lighter bar, that's telling you we're getting more petitions than we would expect based on the needs in that area. And where it's lower, we're getting fewer petitions than we would expect. So the chart on the left then looks at how does this vary by the prosperity of the neighborhoods. So in our more prosperous neighborhoods, on the left side of the chart, we're getting more petitions than the needs that are there. And conversely, in the less prosperous areas, those petitions are underrepresented. We saw the same thing when using, again, the racial equity toolkit. We looked at race and ethnicity. In our neighborhoods that have more white population, we're getting more petitions. They're overrepresented relative to need. So,
Can I ask,
Yeah.
the metric for prosperity, is it AMI or?
there was an index that we used that was developed a few years ago, so I could follow up with you, but I think it had multiple inputs to it, and I don't have them at my fingertips. Okay, so let's jump into our engagement. So we took this data analysis and we wanted to go out to the community and see what we could learn about, well, what are the root causes of this difference that we're observing? We used the data analysis to drive that engagement effort. So we mapped where are the parts of the city that have been underrepresented in the program. And we targeted mailings. We mailed postcards to those residents. And we also planned our pop-up events to try to reach those residents at existing events happening in those communities. We also had an online community survey open to everyone. So the whole city, was made aware of this. We used social media and listservs to push out this survey, but we did want to especially make sure we were reaching those particular areas. This map just kind of shows you our back check on that. Did we succeed in reaching those areas? The red polygons are the areas we identified as being underrepresented in the program, and the blue shaded areas in the background are showing you where we got responses. So we did see that we were getting responses from those areas we were targeting with our survey and with our outreach. And I want to say that the Office of Community Engagement was critical to this effort. We had people on our team from that office, including Dale, who is here with us. Okay, so what did we learn from the engagement? Most importantly, we learned that the majority of residents want sidewalks in their neighborhoods, and we are not seeing correlation with where the participation was happening in the petition program and where people want sidewalks. So while there are some residents who are telling us they don't want sidewalks, consistently the majority are saying they do want sidewalks. We did ask some demographic questions.
Can I ask a question, Ann? When people say they don't want sidewalks, what's the reason?
I was reviewing the comments this morning, and a lot of times the reason is they don't want to disturb their front yard, to be honest with you. That's one of the reasons we hear. That it will affect their property. Some people are concerned about loitering on the sidewalk. Those are a couple of the things we hear.
Okay, thank you.
So we did look at demographics in the survey, and we found that our younger residents were more likely to want sidewalks. Those that have moved to Raleigh more recently are more likely to want sidewalks, and renters are more likely to want sidewalks than property owners, perhaps pointing to that concern about the impact. So that was kind of some of the groups that stood out when we looked at all the demographics that were considered. We did ask in the survey, what are the most important destinations to you that we should be focusing on with our neighborhood sidewalks, and schools really stood out as the number one destination. Again, we're thinking about the sidewalks in the neighborhoods, versus the major streets. And it makes a lot of sense that folks are very concerned about their kids walking to school in those neighborhoods. We hear that over and over again with the residents that reach out to us about these projects. So I'm going to move into 4 policy revisions that we are recommending as a result of all of these findings of the data analysis and the engagement. The first overarching recommendation is to switch from petition-based project identification to a data-driven identification. Basically, we're saying look at identifying all the key connections that are missing through all of our neighborhoods and create a project list and use scoring and move forward on those projects instead of relying on residents coming to us with a petition, since this petition process is not working for all of our residents. Scoring is the next revision. Again, I've been saying how we have these 2 buckets. We have our major street sidewalks and our local street sidewalks. Right now, we have a scoring matrix in the pedestrian plan for the major streets, and then we have a different matrix for our local streets. We are recommending to streamline that. We want to make it easy to understand for the public, transparent, and easy for staff to really keep updated consistently. And this also works with the accountability step in this process, where we can continue to tweak the scoring as we need to, as we're talking to the public and hearing their feedback about how this is working. Balloting is the third proposal. So currently, all projects are balloted. They only ballot those that live along the street where the sidewalk would be, and they do not include renters who might live along the street. So our proposal is that if a street is designated in the street plan, that plan is the result of community engagement and is part of our, adopted community plan, and implies the need for a sidewalk. So in that case, we wouldn't use balloting on those projects. If a street is providing that key connection through a neighborhood but is not designated, we would use balloting to go to that community and talk to them about the project. But we would include both owners and renters and include all residents within 2 blocks of the street, since sidewalks serve the entire neighborhood, not just the residents on the street. And the final revision to consider is with this shift from petition-driven to data-driven, we want to be clear about the amount of resources to devote to the major streets versus these local streets. We think they're both important. We hear from the community about both types. But of course, our major streets serve more of our bus lines and have real safety implications for people walking. And so we brought forward for you to think about a 70% allocation to the major streets versus 30% to the local streets as a target. We want your feedback on that. That kind of aligns with what was in the 2017 bond as kind of some context for you. So those, again, are the four policy revisions, shifting from petition-driven to data-driven, a simplified, transparent, and consistent scoring approach, limiting balloting to undesignated streets and expanding the participation in that, and targeted funding allocation going forward. So I'm happy to answer your questions, dig in wherever you would like.
Thank you, Ann. Thanks for including renters. I think that's really important and a missing piece, and appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into this. Any questions? Councilmember Patton?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for this. I was curious if the backlog is completed in construction or just funded.
The backlog is funded. It's in the queue. It's not completed.
Okay. Got it. And then in your slide that showed the 8 miles of major streets and 8 miles of local streets, well, how would you describe the funding allocation there? Did it match that 70-30 that you're asking us to deliberate on, or was the funding more like 50-50 to produce this outcome?
I would say it's more 70-30 because the major street sidewalks tend to cost more than the local street sidewalks, so it takes more dollars to get 8 miles.
Okay. So this probably had that 70-30 distribution like the one you're asking us for feedback on.
That's right. It doesn't align exactly. I was saying the 2017 bond was 70-30, but those projects weren't necessarily constructed in this 5-year period. And sometimes allocations happen in between the bond cycles. So we were trying to find the best way to simplify it.
Yeah.
But the 2017 bond, when we looked at what are the projects, how did we split it up in there, it was 70-30. And I think that's been fairly consistent as the flows have come in.
Got it.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that related to the major streets? When you're calculating that, is it primarily streets that are heavily transit used, or how are you defining that? And what data are you using to
To
Determine that.
identify the major street projects?
yeah.
Yeah, so that's all of our avenues, all over the city, all of our multi-lane streets. And those, anything that's in the street plan would pretty much would follow into the major street category, except for neighborhood street is a designation in our street plan, and what we call an avenue 2-lane undivided. So it's 2 lanes and there's no median. So most of our transit corridors are on major streets. There are a few transit corridors that go through neighborhoods, but the majority of our streets where more of our crashes are happening are the major streets. Most of the transit is on the major streets. Most of the commercial destinations are on the major streets. And all of those are inputs into the scoring.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Councilmember Patton, I didn't.
No, that's okay. It's a good follow-up. I think I just have one more. As a broad comment, I think this makes good sense. I think it's logical and will serve on greater equity outcomes. So into the idea, one question I did have was I was sort of likening this to the traffic calming program. And I know that, they operate on like worst first and then conditions change. And so I know it's not an apples to apples, but I have seen where it's communicated to the resident, like based on your scoring and how many projects we do in a year, you're likely to not see this project until 2028. There's some sort of like loose estimate provided to the resident just so they have some frame of reference. Is that, one, how many projects do you think you'll be able to deliver in a year under this new system? And then would there be a way to communicate to residents, like, yep, we evaluated that street based on the scoring of that street. This is a 2030 sidewalk kind of deal.
Yeah, great question. In terms of the number of projects we can deliver, we're going to need to work with our partners in engineering services to figure that out. But our goal is to get on a cadence where we're consistently delivering sidewalks and can provide more certainty. And I think this is a piece of that puzzle in having this list, getting on that regular cadence so that we can provide an estimate for folks. So I think we can absolutely do that, and that's the goal here.
Okay, Councilmember Harrison.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on the neighborhood streets versus the major thoroughfares. When I saw the prioritization factors in the backup memo, it's safety, destination access, transit access, and equity. And so I just wonder if that kind of gets at where we need to have that split. Because like you were saying, like the major streets are going to have maybe more safety issues. So is there really a need for an additional, weight to say 70-30? Can we just use these factors that you've already indicated?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had a lot of conversation about that. I think you're asking, do we need these two buckets or do we just score everything together? And you could argue either way, to be transparent. Our thought process in maintaining the buckets and scoring them against them, like scoring the major streets against the major streets, the local streets against the local streets, is we think that the local streets aren't going to score as high as those major streets. Okay. And we do hear from the community that they do want the sidewalks in their neighborhoods. So we want to put a lot of resources into the major streets, but set aside some to continue to build out the neighborhood sidewalks.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay. Great work. I really appreciate the equity, and like I said, bringing in more people like renters. They live here, and they should have a say. So thank you, and we'll look forward to having you bring this back to us. Okay, thank you. All right, that is it for our work session. I'm going to adjourn the meeting, and we will be back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you.